evening, everyone. It's fantastic to have so many of you here to hear about the results of the work that we did at Burrough Hill in between 2010 and 2014. The focus of this talk is going to be an excavation and research project on the Iron Age Hillfort at Burrough Hill that the University of Leicester and ULAS jointly ran for 5 years, which the main aim was to learn more about the Hillfort itself. It also doubled as a way of introducing archaeology students to fieldwork techniques and excavation techniques, that kind of thing. We also involved a whole number of distance learning students from around the globe and local volunteers from local fieldworker groups, and also hosted many tours and visits from school children. So it was an all-round success, really, in terms of bringing part of Leicestershire's prehistory to a massive amount of people. Now, for those of you who don't know what a hillfort is, hillfort, as the name implies, it's a fortification on a hill. Archaeologists are pretty blatant with their naming of things, and that's where we get the term hillfort from. They're a type of feature from the later prehistoric period. Some of them become established in the Bronze Age, but they're most synonymous with the Iron Age. And I think if you were to think about Iron Age archaeology in Britain, these types of feature are very prominent in the landscape. They've survived very well. They consist of massive earthworks that people built to create these defended hilltop settlements. And because they're away from development and in the countryside, they just last, and they've survived incredibly well, and they're very obvious as archaeological features. Now, I don't live too far away from this particular hillfort. It's just a few miles away from Melton Mowbray, where I live, and I drive past this site most of the days when I go to work, when I'm out walking in the local countryside. So it's very much in my consciousness, if you like. And for an archaeologist who's interested in the Iron Age, it was a real treat to be able to go and work on this site. And so hopefully we'll give you a flavour of the discoveries that we made going through the 5 years at the Hillfort. It's a fantastic project with many significant finds, which we'll look at as we go along. What I'd like to point out before I start, though, this reconstruction drawing by Laura Grace Haynes, who's a reconstruction artist, is one of a few that you'll see going through the talk tonight. And a couple of years ago I was asked to sort of bring more people into this talk. The archaeology necessarily involves a lot of talk about objects, and it's sometimes very difficult to for people to visualize the actual people that lived there and how they might have interacted with the landscape and the site itself. But Laura's paintings, as I discovered a couple of years ago, really kind of capture the essence of Iron Age life, as I understand it from the work I've done. And this picture in particular could almost be looking out across the landscape from Burrough Hill. So if you're interested in her work, please go and visit her website. She's done lots and lots of different periods, lots of different work, and there's a link to her website at the end of the talk. So this is Burrough Hill. It's a nice seasonal photo, taken from the air. It's a late winter photo covered in snow, and it really picks out the earthworks of the Hillfort itself. So what you can see, if I can get my mouse to go, yep, there you go. So these are the ramparts of the Hillfort. They enclose a sort of trapezoidal space of about 5 hectares in extent. There's a main entrance here, which is defined by this interned passageway. There's almost like what I like to call the back door of the Hillfort, a second entrance here in the southwest corner. We'll talk about that a bit later. And the other things that you can see going around, this corrugated effect here, that's the remains of ridge and furrow, medieval farming. And you can just about, it's not so obvious inside the Hillfort, but you can just about pick out the lines going from north to south across there. there was ridge and furrow in there at one point as well. And so in the medieval period, between perhaps the 12th and 15th century, the Hillfort itself was a ready-made field for the local farmers, and they ploughed it up as part of their agricultural regime. If we look at it in a slightly more landscape view, you'll see that the Hillfort itself sits on the end of this very long finger of land. Essentially, it's a promontory hillfort, and it's sat on the western end of this promontory. It makes really good use of the steep sides of the hill here on the north, west and southern sides. And the only really sort of critical area in terms of defensiveness of this site is on the eastern side, because it's got this very flat approach. The site itself is one of the highest points in the area. It's about 200 metres above sea level, and that's one of the highest points in the area of what we call High Leicestershire. That's about as high as it gets, but it can be pretty bleak up there. It's quite exposed. Now, as a sort of prominent feature in the landscape, it has attracted quite a lot of attention from early archaeologists, or antiquarians as they were known. And this is a picture, a drawing that was done by William Stoopley, who some of you may know. He was a famous antiquarian of the 18th century who travelled the country drawing historical and archaeological sites. He did some of the early famous pictures of Stonehenge, Avebury, that kind of thing. But Burrough Hill was seen as sufficiently important for him to make an image of himself. You can see the village of Burrough on the hill over here. There's the church. You can see him. He always used to put himself in his pictures as a scale. And there's his friend and his dog he brought along as well to enjoy the experience. But it really gives you also a fantastic sort of picture of the landscape surrounding Burrough Hill. And you can see the remains of the ridge and furrow and how extensive that must have been around the Hillfort itself. But before Stoopley visited the site, an even earlier antiquarian, John Leyland, who visited the site in the 16th century, recorded this quote here that's in italics at the top to say what was going on a yearly basis on Whit Sunday for the local people. And I think that gives us a very kind of interesting insight into how special this place is in the landscape to the local people who would gather here for games, etc. And we know from records that they would gather for fairs and general meetings at certain times of the year when it was proper to do so. And so it was probably seen as a ready-made venue for this kind of event. But it's interesting because there is such a long and varied history of Burrough Hill. It's now a country park that's sort of run by Leicestershire County Council. It's a working farm. So lots of people visit the site and they experience it in lots of different ways. And I think it's that kind of longevity of use and it being a very conscious part of the landscape that makes it special to people that come along. Now, the picture in the left-hand corner is an image from the 19th century, which is when Burrough Hill was actually a racetrack. And talking about it being a ready-made venue, it was actually a really ready-made racetrack and like an arena, if you like. And the image at the top of that picture is people sitting on, excuse me, on the ramparts, watching the races go around inside the Hillfort itself. There is even a story that an early version of the Grand National took place in the 1840s, and we're not quite sure whether that's true or if that's just something that's sort of become part of local folklore. But we do know that there was a famous Grand National runner called Burrough Hill Lad, who was a racehorse that was bred in a stable near to the Hillfort. So there's lots of connections there. Sometime after Stoopley visited the site, John Tailby did the first, I suppose, first kind of properly measured plan of the Hillfort, and he's done it in a plan view, as we can see here. There's the entrance. He's captured the entrance in the top corner there. But you can also see from what he's recorded, lots of holes in the ramparts, and they're still there today. They're a product of erosion, removal of stone from the local villagers that were taking stone away to be to make houses, that kind of thing. The site is made from ironstone. It's founded on ironstone, and it would have been a very useful local building material. So there's been some quarrying over the years, started quite early. One great big hole in the rampart, which is still visible today on this side here, may have been to enable plough teams to get in the medieval period, to make it easier for them to get through and plough the site. It wasn't until 1960 that, and a few years around that, any kind of excavation took place at Burrough Hill that we know of. I beg your pardon, there was one earlier excavation. I'll show you that in a minute. But that resulted in a very detailed measured survey. As you can see, you've got the ramparts, you've got all of the hachures on there to show the slope. It's even got the detail of the hill itself, these contour marks going down, so you really get a strong visual indication there that's very reliable in terms of how we would see a plan today. They've even gone to the effort of doing cross sections to show how high the ramparts are. And that was part of a series of 20th century investigations. The earliest one, 1935, there are some records of it, but unfortunately we don't really know exactly where it was from. And the finds from that excavation are sadly gone now. They've gone missing. However, it does appear that they plonked down somewhere on the main ditch in front of the ramparts at the front of the Hillfort, and they may have been digging around in the upper layers of that ditch. But it was the first meaningful excavations took place in the 60s. And that also incorporated a very early version of geophysical survey, which was like an early version of magnetometry that the time team used today, or you've seen on the time team we use today quite a lot as part of our work. There is actually quite an interesting bit of footage. It was quite basic. Basically, someone was going up and down the Hillfort on a grid, taking readings and shouting those readings to someone who sat in the middle of the Hillfort with a bit of graph paper on a board, and they were plotting them down, you know, quite laboriously, one at a time. But that particular method was very good at picking up where pits were, and on the basis of their results, they targeted a couple of pits, and they got some very good results. The best being this particular pit, which is P7, I think, up in the corner here. And from that pit, they produced two fantastic quern stones, these grinding stones, like sort of hand millstones, made of millstone grit, imported from Derbyshire, and a complete pot. Now, a lot of the time when we dig these pits, we tend to think of them as rubbish pits. These aren't. This isn't rubbish. These are both of these querns were unused. The pot is a complete pot. There's something about this deposit which is quite unusual, and we'll come back to that as we go along. But it gave us a very early clue as to the types of things we might expect when we came to do further work at the Hillfort. Now, the main focus of the work in 1960 was an excavation in the entrance, and that produced some fantastic evidence to show what had been preserved there. And peeling back the layers of turfs and the soil, it quickly became clear that the entrance was actually paved with this fantastic cobbled road surface going all the way through into the interior, being lovingly cleaned here by this student. This was also a University of Leicester excavation, student training excavation. It was edged by these ironstone, dry stone walls, and you can see that in much more detail here. And there was also evidence for massive timber gates just around here, and here are huge post holes. They're about 1 metre in diameter. And the idea is that they would have held massive, sort of almost hole dressed tree trunks, which would have held huge timber gates barring the entrance into the hill fort for anyone that they didn't want to come in, basically. This excavation then, in the 1960s, the favourite way of digging was what's known as the Mortimer Wheeler box section, and that was an excavation method pioneered by famous archaeologist Sir Mortimer Wheeler, and they basically dug these sort of 5 foot wide square boxes, leaving an unexcavated bulk in between, which kind of limited what they could see, but it did give them a way into the archaeology. And this is a picture that was taken a little time after, but you can see this is the entrance, but you can see, if you look down here closely, you can see the earthworks of those boxes picked out quite neatly, where the soil has sunk in, where they've backfilled it. And then 10 years after that, the Hillfort was leased to Leicestershire County Council, who took it on then as a country park. So it's been a country park since 1970. And after that, there was a little bit of work done in the northern interior. Looked at some of the rampart area there, and some more pits were excavated that gave an interesting kind of range of dates from Iron Age occupation all the way through to Roman, which is a little bit unexpected. So it proved that in some areas of the hill fort, occupation was going beyond where you might expect for an Iron Age hill fort. But really, that was the end of archaeological investigation for a long time really, until we came along in 2010. And in the meantime, a lot of the work that we've done as developer archaeologists has focused on the landscape surrounding the hill fort. And this is a map that's probably quite out of date now, but it does show you the spread of Iron Age activity across Leicestershire and Rutland. So all of these dots represent a known site, an excavated site, where a find's been made that indicates settlement, that kind of thing. You can see it's the big spread of settlement across the area. And as part of that work, we've discovered that there was a very wide variety of Iron Age settlement in our area. Now, all of these sites are shown at the same scale, and they go from here's Burrough Hill. This is one of the other hill forts that we know about, Bury Camp, which has seen hardly any work at all, so we really don't know anything about that one. But on the other end of the scale, you have these what are known as small enclosed farmsteads. They're much smaller, as you can see. They're probably the family dwelling of a single extended family, like a little farm. But in recent years, we've started to find these much bigger landscape type settlements that don't seem to have any kind of clear boundaries. They just spread across the landscape. They're not, some people think they might be like early Iron Age villages, but when we've looked at them, they're a product of certain shifts of settlement over a long time. That said, they do seem to be made up of several families, so perhaps a little hamlet, pooling resources, different specialisms, that kind of thing, to get by and live in a slightly different way. But you can see that these sites are actually as big, if not bigger, than some of the hill forts. So if we're thinking that hill forts are at the top of the settlement tree, if you like, then what does that say about the relationship between these sites and the hill fort itself? And here's a local example from a recent site at Melton Mowbray that was excavated. And this site is actually the same size as Burrough Hill. It covers around 5 hectares in extent. It's not a hill fort, but it's very similar in terms of how it's made up. And you can see it's very, very busy, lots of overlapping roundhouses, that kind of thing. So coming to this project in 2010, we thought the time is right to bring Burrough Hill back into our ways of thinking about the Iron Age. It's clearly an important site. We know a lot more about the settlement evidence around the hill fort. It's time to bring it in and see how that fits in. The other point in question is that a lot of our understanding of hill forts is based on excavations from further south and west, in places like Wessex and the Welsh Marches, where hill forts are a lot more evident. They're much more sort of spaced around in the landscape. We don't have much of a narrative about how these sites work from places like the Midlands. So it's really important to add a new voice to our understanding of the hill fort. So these are the questions, the broad questions that we came to the project with, in terms of what we wanted to learn and how that might influence how we worked. We're also very aware of preconceptions. When we think of hill forts, the immediate thing, Celtic warriors, chieftains, warfare, places of power, that kind of thing. Was this really the case? And so we wanted to sort of challenge, maybe, you know, sort of bear that in mind, but not come into this project with those preconceived ideas. Let's see how we got on. So the first thing we did was a comprehensive geophysical survey. So building on the work that was done in 1960, this is what we get from the magnetometry survey these days, and this is called a grayscale. And basically everything that's on there that is black, the dots and the lines, that's an archaeological feature. It picks out the ridge and furrow very nicely. You can see that as a stripiness here inside the hill fort too, going away there. And just to orientate yourself, this is the entrance here. And so it's a very busy archaeological site. Even just by looking at the geophysical survey, before we'd even put a spade in the ground, you could learn a lot more about Burrough Hill just from looking at this. So there's this whole spread of pits, several hundred, all across the hill fort, giving you an idea of the depth of time that people have occupied the site, because if all of these pits were open in one go, it would have been very difficult to walk from one side to the other without falling into one of them. So it's really showing you that there's a whole sequence of events leading up to this end result. There were a series of ditches and things up in the north side, giving us an idea of how space was organised up there. I don't know if you can see circular features I've highlighted in red. Now these are remains of Iron Age roundhouses. As I said, this can be quite a bleak and inhospitable place at certain times of the year. And it's interesting to note that a lot of these roundhouses are sitting around the edge in the lee of the ramparts, making use of that shelter from the banks above them. So that's quite interesting. The big surprise, and this is going back to one of the preconceptions of that this was a sort of fortified settlement, no one's coming in, you know, we're here protecting what we have, to find there's a whole load of settlement outside the hill fort, outside that main defended zone, if you like, and we hadn't expected that at all, and it's only really from the geophys that we were able to discover it. It's interesting, it does seem very connected. It's bounded by this ditch that comes along here and through here. It gets a bit faint along here, but you can see it's actually quite tightly mirroring the ditch that sits in front of the hill fort. So it's clearly connected. There are enclosures, there are more roundhouses, there's a great big enclosure here, and we'll talk about that later, and lots more pits and things going on there. So that was a very early indication of what we might expect as we go along. Now, in a 5-year project, this is a massive site. We wouldn't be able to get anywhere near excavating all of it, and we will want to. I mean, we're there to sample certain areas and leave some for future researchers. But the geophysics was very useful in terms of helping us to identify certain areas that we wanted to excavate. And the idea behind this was that we wanted to excavate in as many different parts of the hill fort as we possibly could, to give ourselves a nice geographical spread across the monument, but also to look at a range of different features. So we're talking about mostly about the Iron Age hill fort, but Burrough Hill has, like I was saying before, has had a very long history of use and occupancy, and people visiting the site and making use of its prominence in the landscape. And almost every trench that we excavated at Burrough Hill and hadn't really been seen before from previous excavators. We found collections of flints, so earlier prehistoric tools, the majority of which dated back to the Mesolithic, so around 10,000 years ago, give or take. And at this point, people would have been hunter-gatherers, crossing the landscape throughout the year, looking for natural resources, following the movements of animals. And so potentially people that came to Burrough Hill were making use of that vantage point to look out onto the landscape and see the animals that were moving around that they were tracking and hunting. So that's a really interesting addition to the use of the landscape, and we didn't really know that before we started the work. Now, if we track forward several thousand years, the first indication of activity that predated the Hillfort that involved people digging holes and creating things on the Hillfort was this little monument. It's out right on the edge in the southwest corner. It's very close to that back door to the Hillfort that I mentioned, the second entrance. And what's outlined in blue here is what we know as a hengiform monument. So we call that a hengiform monument because it's like a henge, but not quite. So it's a sort of, it's a way of describing something which we don't really know what it is, but it's similar to another type of monument. But this is dated to the late Neolithic, early Bronze Age, so around 3000 BC, that kind of thing. It consists of a C-shaped ditch, which would have been accompanied by a bank. There's a little pit behind it. And in the arc of the ditch is the remains of a little sunken featured building with an inlaid clay floor. Now in that building we found lots of flint working debris, Bronze Age scrapers, arrowheads, all very indicative of activity and activities going on in that particular building. In the ditch itself and in the pit behind it, we found some lovely beaker style pottery, which is typical of that period, late Neolithic, early Bronze Age. You can see beautifully decorated stuff with this sort of geometric designs on it. And this has had someone press their fingernails into the wet clay before it was fired to create this effect here. I do remember this student's name. She was called Yvonne. This was the first time she'd ever dug on a site, and she was able to find this extremely rare pottery for our area, so that was a fantastic sort of day for her. But quite an interesting addition, certainly to our understanding of archaeology for that period in our part of the world, but also in terms of thinking about how, you know, just how special this place was in earlier prehistory to the people that lived and worked in the area. I don't think it's any coincidence that this monument was sat at the very end of the promontory where it could be seen from people down below. So I think that's an interesting aspect to think about that. Okay, so moving into the Iron Age. Unfortunately, we weren't able to demonstrate very clearly when the Hillfort was established. The earliest dates that we've had back so far, we're still waiting on some radiocarbon dates, was the 4th to 3rd century, so the Middle Iron Age. But potentially the Hillfort could have been established in the 5th century BC. It would be quite late in terms of what we know about the dating of Hillforts for this one to be established in the 3rd to 4th century. So odds on it is slightly earlier, and I'm sure further work would be able to corroborate that. This is based on excavations that were done in the earlier work, looking at the rampart, and they concluded that ironstone was used. The external face was probably a very nicely built dry stone wall with a core of ironstone rubble. It was all quarried locally from the site, and as I mentioned, on the frontage, one of the immediate things you see when you walk up to the Hillfort is a massive ditch, and this is likely where a lot of the stone was quarried from. And once that ditch was open, it would have accentuated the defensiveness of that side of the Hillfort. Some of these ramparts have timber lacing to hold the whole thing together like a framework. There's no evidence of that we've seen from the Hillfort. Very little dating. And so there's a very sort of piecemeal nature of a picture of our understanding of that. We were able to do some further investigation in the final year of the project as an add-on to the excavation work that we were doing, that recorded some of the areas of erosion. There's lots of badger and rabbit activity that's exposed quite a lot of the rampart in the through the grass and the soil. And the picture that we were seeing pretty much backed up this. So that there's not a lot to say about the ramparts themselves other than this, but they would have been impressive, I'm sure. If you know the site, or you visit the site, or when you're looking at the photos going through, you can see that everything's covered in soil and grass at the moment. When you visited the site in the Iron Age, you would have been faced by this fantastic orange dry stone wall. It would have looked incredibly impressive, I'm sure, and very grand for people that were visiting it for the first time. We did get to look at the ramparts in the entrance. We concentrated quite a lot on the entrance and revisiting those excavations from the earlier work in 1960. And over the 2 seasons, we were able to get an understanding that the entrance itself and that very long entrance passage is actually quite the end result of quite a complex series of building. The initial entrance, perhaps in the 5th century BC when the Hillfort was established, seems to have been just a simple gap in the rampart circuit, probably defended with a very big gate, as we've seen from the post holes in the other area. Again, you can see those here, some of those here, the later ones. And at some point later on, the Hillfort passage was extended, so the interned entrance was developed, but it only went about halfway, and that's what you can see here in this part of the picture. It went in by about 15 meters of the 30 or so that there currently is, and we don't know the reason for that. There was clearly some sort of reasoning behind it, whether or not it was to add to the defensibility of the entrance or to make it a bit more of a theatre coming into the Hillfort. We don't really know. But a subsequent enlargement that took place actually widened the area itself, and you can see that it's defined here by a dry stone wall. There's a bit gone. That was hit by the medieval ploughing, but there's the front here, coming alongside that fantastic sort of cobbled entrance road, and here are the post holes for the gates. But the reason it was widened at that point was to incorporate a little room, which the 1960s excavators recognised, and they are seen on other hill forts that we know of, and they're often interpreted as guard chambers. And here's another view of that from down below, and you can see it survived really well. It's got fantastic upstanding walls, dry stone walls again, and the radiocarbon dating that we've been able to establish from the floors within the building or within the room suggest it was occupied between the 4th and the 2nd centuries BC. As we excavated down, there was this fantastic sequence of each floor, each occupied with its own hearth, and given us a really good insight into the occupancy of this building. Is something we never really see. A lot of the archaeology that we deal with has been ploughed out, so a lot of that detail has been removed. But this, because it was sat within the Hillfort and it had been backfilled quite quickly in the early Roman period, when the Hillfort seems to, or this part of the Hillfort seems to have gone out of use, it preserved that information very well. And here's a view showing one of those floors with its hearth in the centre. And there's some of the students excavating that. Here's another hearth, but you can see crushed pottery, lots of animal bone where it was dropped as people lived and worked in the area. And again, talking about those preconceptions that I mentioned at the beginning, I don't doubt that perhaps at certain times of the life of the Hillfort, this was used as a guard chamber. And there's probably another one on the other side if we go by of the entrance. If we go by examples from other hill forts. But interestingly, as we excavated, we found lots of evidence for distinctly non-military or guard-like activities, as you might expect, little craft working activities. So we found lots of evidence for weaving, some evidence for metalworking. So presumably at certain times of the year or certain times of the lifespan of the hill forts, perhaps this area wasn't used as a guard chamber, or if it was and they were bored whilst on guard duty, they were given little jobs to do to keep themselves occupied. But there's, again, really fascinating insight into the different types of activity that took place, and that you shouldn't always take the obvious interpretation at face value. Now, when we looked outside that chamber, we came across this very large pit full of rubble, which had been excavated partly in the 1960s. And you can see here in the picture on the left, it was very much in the corner of one of their boxes, so they could only go down so far before they ran out of space. But because we had more space, we were able to get down to the bottom of it to discover it was actually a grave of someone that lived and died at Burrough Hill. It's a burial of a young man, aged between 18 and 22. Sounds young by our standards, but by Iron Age standards, he was probably in his middle age. We don't know an obvious cause of death for this person, but he was obviously buried in a very revered kind of way. He was buried in what we call a stone kist, so a stone-lined burial chamber. He actually had a pillow stone under his head, and he was buried in a crouched position, so you can sort of see his knees are drawn up onto his chest and his arms were folded over. So very much a sort of crouched, sort of fetal position he was buried in. He was buried directly beneath that road surface, so anyone coming in and entering the hill fort would have had to pass over his grave. And whether or not that was by design or by accident, we don't really know. But the positioning of this grave was at the very same point where the original extension of the entrance stopped and the second extension began. So whether or not there's any kind of significance to his burial at this particular point, we don't really know. We can only speculate. But it does seem to be quite unusual. And it's certainly unusual in terms of finding the remains of Iron Age people. This is only one of a handful of similar burials from the entirety of Leicestershire and Rutland that don't occur very often at all. So moving away then from the main entrance and looking at the southwest corner where the second entrance is. This was always thought to be an Iron Age entrance, but it was never proven. And I think our excavations showed that it was perhaps an original feature of the earliest stage of the Iron Age hill fort. And we got this very nice rounded ends to the ramparts here that suggested it was a built feature within the design of the ramparts at the time. It doesn't seem to have lasted all the way through to the end of the hill fort though. And what we found surprisingly was that this dry stone wall here had actually blocked it off at a certain point. We don't know when that happened, but clearly it went out of use at one point. Now it's interesting to think about because this, the entrance does lead down to the base of the hill via a nice sunken path to where there are natural springs at the bottom of the hill. So that's a really good source of where they could have got water from for themselves and for their animals. But it's interesting to think that for some reason it was taken out of commission, and we don't really know why. But it's interesting also to think that the style of the dry stone walling and the way it's made is very similar to the dry stone walling that was incorporated in the accentuation of the main entrance. So I know one sort of dry stone walling looks much the same as another, but it did strike us from looking at the two at the time that they were very similar. So it may be that whilst this was going out of use, a lot of the emphasis was being placed on the main entrance to make that much more grand, for whatever reason that was going on. But clearly there was some reason why they stopped using this entrance at, partway through the life of the hill fort. Okay, so just moving on to look at the extramural settlement, as we called it, the settlement that was freshly discovered by the geophysical survey. And here's a view from the entrance to where we were excavating that part of the site. We excavated, we targeted several of the roundhouses, and we found that actually there's quite an interesting organisation to the domestic setup in this area, which, if you remember for later when we talk, it sort of carries on into the organisation of the roundhouses in the Hillfort itself. Does seem to be quite a feature of this site. Here's one of the roundhouses here, and you can see we've sort of part excavated it. The entrance is here, facing to the east. Behind it is a little sort of squashed square enclosure, and that seems to be part and parcel of the organisation of this house, in that it is connected to the roundhouse. So they're built together, and within the enclosure are a series of pits, which do contain domestic rubbish. So it seems that you know, the roundhouse and the enclosure go quite well together, and it's actually quite tidy in terms of creating a barrier around any kind of hazards where the pits might be. Now, the dating that we got from these roundhouses, this excavation, was very similar to the dating that we got for the extension of the entrance. So the two seem to be quite linked, quite specifically. So whether or not we see this as a settlement that was added to while the Hillfort was being extended, which may be the case. So these may have been the builders, and these may have been you know, this may have been where they lived while they were building this part of the Hillfort. I don't know. This may be an explanation, but there seems to be a bit more permanency about the settlement here than just kind of itinerant kind of builders camp. So maybe it started like that, and they developed a settlement outside it that carried on. But again, it's one of the mysteries that we've uncovered as part of this excavation. Now, moving inside the Hillfort, we looked at a number of different areas to try and get as broad a picture of life in the Hillfort as we could. We started off by looking at a selection of pits, and this little cluster just inside the Hillfort entrance seemed to be a good area to target. And it did prove to be really interesting, because what we got to add to the excavation from 1967 was a really broad date range of pits, from the Iron Age all the way through to the early Roman sort of 1st century AD transitional period. So it shows that activity on the Hillfort did carry on in some form into the early Roman period, and just to, you know, beyond the Roman conquest. It may have been in a very different kind of way to how it was occupied in the Iron Age. But a lot of these pits preserve very deeply in the rock that they were cut into, and a lot of these are probably deep grain storage pits. One of the ideas about Burrough Hill is that it was a community storage area for the farming community that lived around it, and they could bring their produce to store in a safe environment for the winter. And a lot of these pits were that kind of thing, very deep, sort of flat-bottomed silos, if you like. But when they go out of use, they have to be filled in to prevent them being a hazard, and this is where we get a lot of our information from, in terms of the lifestyle of the people that lived there and what they were doing, by gathering the refuse that they left behind. Pottery, animal bone, to tell us what sort of trading links people had, what they were growing, what they were eating, the types of animals they were keeping, all adding up to the picture of life of people that lived there. But remarkably, at Burrough Hill, and we're talking about perhaps the status of the site in terms of one of the ideas that we may want to question, whether or not it was a high status site or not. We started to get quite a few sort of personal artifacts that we don't really come across on normal farmstead excavations. So lovely little blue glass bead here with this swirly decoration. This is actually a piece of horse gear, a horse harness. So it's a strap junction, it's a decorative piece of bronze work, which would have held two pieces of horse harness together. And we'll see another one of those later on. The Roman activity also gave us further indications of people being buried. This is quite an unusual pit that we found that contained partial remains of a person, but also partial remains of a horse, also buried together with a whole sequence of strange objects, which perhaps would have been part of what you might expect to be a burial group. So a little cup, other bits of paraphernalia that you perhaps would have seen as in early Roman burial, but they're all kind of broken and rather haphazardly placed or thrown in. So whether or not this was a disturbed burial, or it represents a particular type of tradition that we haven't seen before, we don't really know. But another interesting sort of slightly what you might call kind of ritualized kind of discovery as we went on. In the centre of the Hillfort, we targeted what on the geophys looked like a large amorphous blob, and when we excavated it, we found it was a large amorphous blob. But when we started to excavate there, we discovered that this was actually, even though it's an ironstone promontory, this is where a sort of outcropping of clay occurs on the hilltop. And the Iron Age people must have realised where this was, or discovered it as part of their pit digging, perhaps, and decided to exploit it. So this was actually a quarried area, which is part of a much wider quarried area from the geophys, and they seem to be extracting the clay. And we've worked with the geologists at the university to look at the composition of the clay and the composition of some of the pots that we found, and it provides a very good match between the two, which gives us a really good indication that some of the activities, the self-sufficiency of the Hillfort, they're actually producing their own pots. And I don't think that's anything that we've seen before on any other Iron Age sites. That's really interesting additional information. But it also gives you an idea that the community there was fairly self-sufficient. Moving into the southwest corner again. So this was an area that we wanted to look at a complete roundhouse and its environs. And when I talk about roundhouse, this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. You've probably seen some of these before. This is a reconstructed one, I think, at Butts Hillfort in Sussex, or in Dorset, beg your pardon. And so they're like sort of circular huts with wattle and daub walls, and this fantastic sort of thatched conical roof sitting above the walls. What we normally find is a ditch that went around the edge of underneath the eaves of the roof that would have caught the water and stopped it, the rainwater, and stopped it getting at those walls and making them damp. And they show as a really good archaeological feature because they're actually quite deep. The structural remains don't really show. This building, though, in this corner, we not only got the outer drainage gully, but preserved here, quite possibly because it was tucked away in the corner, away from where the medieval ploughing might have affected it. We did get the evidence of the building itself, and the entrance would have been facing east, but unusually we found that it had been completely blocked off quite deliberately. And in quite a contrast to the fines-free ditch and building remains, the blocking material and the soil that blocked the entrance was absolutely packed full of domestic remains. So lots of pottery, huge amounts of charcoal, animal bone, broken quernstones. And just to the side of it, one of the pits that we excavated contained very similar material, lots and lots and lots of domestic debris, to the point that we called it the house clearance pit. And that's probably what it was. The entire domestic contents of this building, for some reason, have been removed, deliberately broken, and deposited in this pit. So you can see the remains of a quernstone here in the base of the pit, and these are all fragments of it. And this is pretty much like an Iron Age jigsaw puzzle. they all went back together to form the quernstone, but it had been quite deliberately broken and deposited in the pit. And the same goes for lots of pottery that we found. This is an example of some of the Iron Age pottery. A broken oven, so we found lots and lots of oven plates made out of fired clay, that kind of thing, and heaps and heaps of hearth remains and charcoal. So there's something quite unusual about why this house has gone out of commission and the activities that are going on around it. This was brought into even sharper focus by the pit that was directly behind the roundhouse, which produced even more strange and possibly, well, quite literally ritual activity going on there. It does seem connected to what was going on with the roundhouse. You can see this is one of those very deep pits again, and we got to the bottom of it. There was lots and lots of ash, lots of charcoal, and at the very bottom we started finding these metal objects. They were quite in quite a well-defined rectangular shape. We didn't really know what was going on to start with, so we found a nice iron knife, these bronze objects, and you can see this is one of those strap junctions that I showed you before, another one of those, and some unusual objects here. And when we got them cleaned, oh, I'm sorry, and there was this very unusual object which seems to be some sort of scraper. You can see it's in the shape of a sort of disposable razor, and it's got this very finely toothed end. As far as we know, this is a unique object, never been found before in Iron Age Britain, so we don't really know what it was for. When we had them cleaned, we were absolutely stunned to see that this was the remains of an Iron Age chariot gear set of fittings. So these are lynch pins that would have held the wheel on the chariot, and you can see they're made of iron with this wonderful sort of bronze coating that holds all of the decoration, this beautiful sort of Iron Age decoration. You can see this sort of Celtic-y, swirly, triskelly decoration here, what appears to be sort of two birds' heads perhaps looking away from each other. It's fine dotted work here, and you can even see, which I find quite fascinating, given that it's a chariot and what would have pulled the chariot, you might even be able to see here, this may be a likeness of a horse's hoof and leg on here. These are aspects of the harness. So these are, this is say part of the harness here. These are known as what are they called? I forgot that. Harness rings. So these would have been across the yoke that went across the horses' backs. They would have guided the reins from the horse's mouth through to the person controlling the chariot. And we thought when we were excavating that deposit that it was a complete set of harness and chariot remains. Subsequent analysis showed that it is in fact the remains of two different and incomplete sets. So the chariot pieces, these lynch pins here, the decoration and style of those is more similar to ones that have been found further north, and this is one where we found the nearest parallel from one of the East Yorkshire graves of the what's known as the Arras culture, where their signature departure, if you like, is to be buried with their chariots. This is where you find the most chariot burials in the country. Seems to be a particular thing with those people that lived up there. But this is one of the chariot burials from Kirkburn, and you can see this is perhaps a little bit more highly decorated, but you can see the similar decoration on the bronze work to the ones that we found. The actual harness decorations, though, are more similar to examples that are found further south. So what might that be telling us? Could it be representative of the connections that people at the Hillfort had? Could it be representative of a coming together of people from those different areas at Burrough Hill? Remember, we're situated very centrally within Britain within England. So it could have been that, you know, people travelling and creating trade contacts, that kind of thing, could well have converged at places like Burrough Hill, you know, which was the centre of the Iron Age world in the UK at the time, geographically. Now, I mentioned ritual when we and the ash that was involved. What we think happened here is that this pit was either open or dug especially for this deposit, but the rectangular arrangement of the material in the bottom of the pit tends to suggest it was placed in the ground within a box or some sort of container. They're quite tightly spaced together. And in fact, that little Iron Age knife that I showed you that accompanied the deposit was actually sat bolt upright against where the chariot remains were. So it was either placed inside the box against the edge or outside the box leaning against it. And a couple of other, the scraper that we found was sort of tilted into the deposit as well, so that could have been sat on top of the container and subsequently gone in as it decayed. The box seems to have been placed on a bed of cereal chaff, which again could have been quite deliberate, and you know, it's a waste product of crop processing, which would have been a very important part of the aspect of the site, and perhaps symbolic of the storage of that kind of material throughout the year. And then quite deliberately, the people who buried it intended to destroy it, because the whole thing was set alight. And we can tell that because the bottom of that pit was completely scorched. It's all of the kind of kindling that they put on top to create the fire had kind of gone out before they potentially before it had intended, and created a whole load of what we call fuel ash slag. So basically it's kind of carbonized material that sat above it. The cereal remains, however, had caught light and gone to ash, and it's really because of those chemical processes that all of this stuff survived in the way it did. So perhaps it didn't really, the final act of depositing and destroying these objects didn't really have the effect that the people that buried them wanted it to, but it certainly helped preserve it for us to study, which is fantastic. But you know, this is clearly something that's thought out and quite deliberate, and for whatever reason, but because of the activity that's going on around the Roundhouse, we do think it is quite connected. So there's something odd going on at that particular area of the Hillfort. And here's a reconstruction of what that chariot might have looked like. And this is based on one of the ones that was found in East Yorkshire. And here's a sort of reconstruction to show where the pieces went. So here's the lynch pins here, the harness rings going over the top, and the decorative pieces. Unfortunately, we didn't find the bits from the ponies, but perhaps the ponies, the horses that pulled the chariot, were kind of represented by the iron objects that went in there, and the knife is very similar to perhaps a farrier's knife, and the scraper we think could be an earlier version, an Iron Age version of a curry comb for grooming horses. So there could have been quite a representation there of the sort of equine nature of people that lived at Burrough Hill. And of course, all of this stuff is incredibly rare, and it's incredibly high status. So potentially, or quite directly, at Burrough Hill, people of status would have lived. Okay, so quickly moving on then to the nearby house that we saw on the geophysics. And you can see also from this photo how wonderfully placed Burrough Hill is in the landscape, to be seen and also to see out. And this was one where we wanted to look at the wider context of another roundhouse, and we found that again, this was a roundhouse that had its own enclosure with pits inside it. And as we saw with the roundhouse we've just looked at, the roundhouse itself was completely clean and clear of finds, but the pits that surrounded it absolutely full of domestic debris. And it seemed that certain pits held certain things. So they were dividing their refuse up for whatever reason, we don't really know. Certain pits were full of animal bone exclusively, and they may have been the remains of feasting that went on at Burrough Hill. For all we know, they could have been clearances from gatherings of people that attended at certain times of the year, and they were then sort of collected up the refuse and marked those events by burying them. There were other pits that contained, again, broken and whole quernstones, other domestic debris. But this one in particular was very interesting because it contained a huge amount of ironwork, and here's some of it. On the left, you can see an iron sickle. On the right, the remains of an iron spear. And this is the remains of a decorative suspension attachment, which perhaps could have held a cauldron over a fire or something similar like that. But you can see that even though they're rusted up, these are all fairly usable objects. They're not broken. So they've been put into the ground when they were still usable, and you have to question whether or not that was a deliberate act as well. And there was more objects. There was probably about, I don't know, 15 to 20 objects from that one pit, which, to put it into context with how we view this site against some of the other Iron Age sites and the farmsteads that we've excavated, from this one pit, that is more ironwork than we've probably found from many of the Iron Age sites that we found in the landscape. So that gives you an idea of the kind of access to that kind of thing, the key metal of the period that Burrough Hill had, and perhaps, you know, raises its importance in that respect. There was also evidence of other craft activities around, this little outdoor hearth and the clay-lined pit, which may have been used for quenching metalwork. Evidence of metalworking. There's a reconstruction of that kind of activity. Evidence of spinning. We found these lovely spindle whorls. There's a nice stone one here, and one made on the end of an animal bone. They would have been used for weights and drop spinning. So again, you know, activities of self-sufficiency going on at the Hillfort. Evidence of a bit more sort of industrial type weaving for clothing, for rugs, for blankets, that kind of thing. And this is from these loom weights. And you can see in the pit below there, one of them poking out. And they would have acted as weights on an upright loom to keep everything taut and usable. But they're made from sort of unfired clay. They got these holes in there for suspending them. But they're pretty unusual. They often don't survive because they break to pieces. But these ones had been buried again in a group, possibly deliberately. They've been, you know, in another pit, suggestive of interesting sort of thought processes going into the disposal of things. They're not just throwing away rubbish. They're perhaps burying things that were representative of activities in the Roundhouse close by. Now, another really interesting aspect of this particular part of the site, we found evidence for gaming. We found these dice, or a few of these dice, all in one particular area. And these sort of flat bone objects, which do look like domino pieces. I don't know how old dominoes is, but they do appear to be gaming pieces. And we've never found evidence of this kind of activity, sort of social life, if you like, on any of the other Iron Age sites that we've excavated. And I suppose from that evidence, you kind of get the idea that everybody was working very hard to sustain themselves throughout the year, and there was very little evidence, very little time for that kind of activity. But here, at this particular building, evidence of social life and other activities taking place. So perhaps that might give us another insight into the status of people that lived at Burrough Hill, and that they did have time to pursue these other kinds of activities. And here is, this is not one of Laura's reconstructions. This is from Glastonbury Lake Village. This is an actual find of one of the dice and a shaker that was found at Glastonbury. This is a waterlogged site, so very, very good preservation of wood. And this is a reconstruction of some Iron Age warriors having a game of dice at that site. So what of Iron Age warriors? Well, that was one of the preconceptions about hillforts that we wanted to wonder about. And interestingly, in all of the work that we did, there was only really this area where we found any evidence of anything like an approximation of an Iron Age warrior, and that came from these objects, which we didn't really know what they were to start with, but a bit of research. These are bronze objects. They're clearly sort of decorative. But what we found out was they're actually the edging from a hide shield, or known as a horned shield. And you can see they're quite rare. This is Burrough Hill, and these are all the other areas where they've been found. And these are little miniatures of those kind of shields that were found in Salisbury. And this is a reconstruction of one. So a rare and unusual find, and a lot of the places that have been where they've been found are high status places, unusual objects, unusual burials. This one from Kent is what's thought to be the burial of a prince, or certainly a high status person. He was buried with his wonderful headgear, his sword, and one of these shields. You can see the remains of that edging there. So another indication perhaps of high status people living at the Hillfort. The only really the only real connection we have perhaps with Celtic warriors at the Hillfort is really interesting to think about, considering the amount of work we did there. We did actually invite some warriors to the final open day though, and these guys did some fantastic reconstruction of Iron Age battles on the Hillfort itself, and you can see them. One of those has got one of those shields there as well. So those two areas of the Hillfort have seen quite distinct ways of living, sort of single generation roundhouses that seem to have gone out of use, and the area hasn't really been used again. When we looked in the northern part of the Hillfort though, we found quite a different picture. Whoops. There was quite a busy response from the geophysics there, and when we targeted that, we found that there was a lot of overlapping roundhouses. They seem to be quite late in the sequence as well. They're late Iron Age, so sort of going forward into the sort of 1st century BC, whereas the ones we've just looked at are more Middle Iron Age, sort of 3rd, 4th century BC. This actually transformed into some of the early Roman, the early 1st century AD activity that we've seen on the site. In fact, shown quite well by this ditch which comes along here. This was an Iron Age version of the ditch, and it was replaced by a Roman version of the ditch, and the two were very distinct from their pottery, but they follow the same lines, indicating it was fulfilling the same sort of function. What we also found was structural evidence of very different structural evidence of Roman activity. This Roman wall, which was quite badly damaged by the medieval ploughing, but if you go back to it, you can see it sort of went all the way across here, did a right angle here, so it's possibly the remains of a Roman barn, that kind of thing. There was also a Roman corn dryer, so a sort of industrial feature that would have dried corn ready to be ground on quern stones to make flour. Very Roman in its character, so it's showing us that people were living there in the early Roman period. Now the focus of activity there is up in the northern quarter, and we didn't really pick up any evidence for Roman activity further down, apart from the pits along here. But when we excavated a section across this big enclosure here, we found that this is actually Roman too. We found evidence of bones, animal bones, pottery, coins, indicative of sort of Roman activity going all the way through from the 2nd to 4th century. And it's all very good domestic stuff. Now, unfortunately, we weren't able to do any more work in this area, but I'd be willing to bet that this is the focus of Roman activity at that period. So they're living close to the Hillfort and using some of it for their occupation, but I would think this is probably a Roman enclosed farmstead. Sadly, we haven't been able to do any more work on that, and that is something we'll have to leave for future researchers. And sadly, that is the nature of an archaeological project like this. You come away with more questions than you came with. But I think, and hopefully you'll agree, having listened to this talk, we have answered quite a lot of questions and really helped to add to our picture of this hill fort, and shown that it is incredibly important in the local area, but can also contribute much to the national understanding of these monuments across the country. So it's shown that there's been occupation on Burrough Hill for a considerable length of time, and if you take into account those early hunter-gatherers, a very long period of time that Burrough Hill has been used, and that part of the landscape has been a special place for people using the area. We've been able to examine areas inside and outside the ramparts, and that's a really important departure from other areas, other hill forts that have been examined, because quite obviously your eye is drawn within the ramparts, and a lot of these places haven't been geophysed in the way that we've done, so people don't really know about what's around the periphery of these sites. So they've been able to enable a much broader understanding of this particular hill fort and the complex changes that were carried out as it went on through time. We think that perhaps it had a relatively small community year round who were the custodians of the hill fort, and if we imagine that it was a sort of central storage place for the local farming community, then they would have been thought of very highly. And I think a lot of the evidence that we gathered from the excavations tends to suggest that this was a high status settlement at certain times of its life. The evidence from the chariots and the other paraphernalia that we found certainly point to that. But also at certain times of the year when people came to get their produce, it may well have been a very nice central place to gather, as the people in medieval times did. They were probably following a tradition that the Iron Age people established when the hill fort was in use. And I think that would have been a really good way for, you know, sort of perhaps a dispersed community to come together, trade with different people from different areas, create bonds, meet marriage partners, that kind of thing. And so it probably would have been quite an important aspect of the social calendar of the Iron Age people that lived and used it. And thinking about when it was first established, and with the aim of it being a community use for storage, I think it's fair enough to think of it as a community project where people came to build the hill fort, and quite possibly they came together to keep it going and refurbish the ramparts as it went along as well. It's quite clear that the status and the high standing of the hill fort was part and parcel with the long distance trading links that it gathered, perhaps from these gatherings, and that's illustrated very well by the amount of quernstones that we got that were all brought in from the Peak District, only 50 or 60 miles away, but that's probably quite a distance for people that only had horse and foot, their own feet to travel on. So the rare and exotic items, you know, really helped to, and the strange ways in which things were deposited really helped to sort of make the site stand out in comparison to some of the other sites that we've excavated in the surrounding landscape. So that really helps to sort of bring Burrough Hill into the wider picture and help us to consider what how this site functioned in respect to all of the other settlements around it. And I think looking outwards, what we've learned from this, the excavation that we've done at Burrough Hill, will really help to give a much more rounded picture in terms of geography of Britain, to how hill forts were established and how they grew and what they were used for, and how they were used subsequently in terms of their special place in the landscape. And I think I'm going to stop talking there. But in case you're interested to search further about hill forts and Burrough Hill, there are certain news items and reports are available on the university websites and the ULAS websites, and we'll be adding to those in the coming weeks. The Ernest Cook Trust, who own the land, they've got a fantastic website. Historic England, who look after the site as scheduled monument, is worth exploring too, as is the rest of the Leicestershire parks. If you live in the area, if you want to look at Laura's work, please visit her website. And if you don't live in the area and you want to explore hill forts in your own part of the world, you live in the UK, there has been this fantastic project in the last few years run by Oxford University that has pulled together information about hill forts from across the UK and created this fantastic searchable atlas. So you can find out about hill forts in your local area if you don't know about them already. Thank you very much for listening. It's been a pleasure.